Disclaimer: the Ember and Ink Studios is not responsible for ruining your childhood. The stories you are about to hear come from historical folklore and the earliest recorded versions of familiar fairy tales. These are the versions that existed before they were softened for children. Listener discretion is advised. Before we begin tonight's story, a small fairy tale fact. The story of Sleeping Beauty is far older and stranger than the version most people recognize today. One of the earliest recorded versions appears in the 17th century, written by the Italian author Giambattista Basile, in a tale called Sun, Moon, and Talia. Later versions of the story were softened considerably. The French writer Charles Perrault reshaped the tale in late 1600s, and in the 19th century, the Brothers Grimm recorded their own version, which most modern retellings are based on. But the earliest versions remind us that many fairy tales were never meant to be gentle stories for children. Long before fairy tales were softened for children, they were warnings. Stories whispered beside hearth fires, carried across centuries, and written down by those who feared they might disappear. But the versions we know today are not the originals. Tonight we open another page in The Dark Origins of Fairy Tales. Episode 2: Sleeping Beauty. The story that shouldn't be a bedtime tale. Most people know the story of Sleeping Beauty. A princess is cursed by a wicked fairy. On her 16th birthday, she pricks her finger on a spinning wheel and falls into a deep, magical sleep. 100 years later, a prince arrives. He kisses the princess, and the spell is broken. It is one of the most famous fairy tales in the world. But like many fairy tales, the version most people know today is not the original. The version popularized by Sleeping Beauty comes from earlier French and German adaptations. In the late 1600s, the writer Charles Perrault published a version in which the sleeping princess is awakened by a prince. Later, the Brothers Grimm recorded their own telling, but both of these versions were already softened. The earliest known literary version of the story is far darker. In 1634, the Italian writer Giambattista Basile published a collection of stories called the Pentamerone. Inside this book appears a tale titled Sun, Moon, and Talia. This is one of the earliest recorded versions of Sleeping Beauty. In Basile's story, a noble girl named Talia falls into a deep sleep after a piece of flax becomes lodged beneath her fingernail. Her father, believing she has died, places her in a great house in the woods. Time passes. One day, a king riding through the forest discovers the sleeping girl. He cannot wake her. What happens next is something modern fairy tales no longer include. The king assaults Talia while she remains unconscious. Then he leaves. Months later, while still asleep, Talia gives birth to twins. The babies eventually remove the piece of flax from her finger, breaking the enchantment. She wakes and names the children Sun and Moon. But the story is far from over. The king eventually returns and discovers Talia alive with the children. There is only one problem. The king is already married. When the queen discovers the existence of Talia and the children, she becomes consumed with jealousy. She orders the twins to be killed. According to the story, she intends to have them cooked and served to the king as a meal. The cook secretly saves the children and prepares another dish instead. The queen then orders Talia herself to be burned alive. But the king learns of the plot before it can be carried out. The queen is executed, and the king marries Talia. While the older versions of Sleeping Beauty told of curses, enchanted sleep, and the triumph of a prince, modern storytellers have often returned to the tale and reshaped it for new audiences. One of the most notable reinterpretations came with the release of the film Maleficent. Rather than telling the story from the princess's perspective, this version shifts the focus entirely to the character who once served as the villain. In the traditional fairy tale, the wicked fairy curses the princess out of spite after being excluded from a royal celebration. But in this retelling, Maleficent is not simply evil. She begins as a powerful guardian of a magical forest kingdom, living in peace among strange and beautiful creatures. As a young fairy, she forms a close friendship with a human boy named Stefan. Over time, their friendship grows into something deeper, but ambition and betrayal eventually tear them apart. Stefan seeks power in the human kingdom and ultimately betrays Maleficent in a terrible act that leaves her physically and emotionally wounded. Consumed by anger and heartbreak, Maleficent later attends the celebration of the newborn Princess Aurora and places the famous curse upon the child. Before the king and queen, she declares that on her 16th birthday, the princess will prick her finger on the spindle of a spinning wheel and fall into a deep sleep. Unlike the traditional fairy tale, however, the story continues to explore Maleficent's regret and her complicated relationship with the princess as Aurora grows. This modern interpretation reflects how many classic fairy tales have been reshaped over time. Characters once portrayed as purely wicked are given deeper motives, and stories that were once simple moral warnings become more complex explorations of betrayal, forgiveness, and redemption. Yet beneath these new interpretations, the shadow of the older story still remains. The tales of a sleeping princess, an enchanted curse, and a world waiting for the moment when the spell is finally broken. Why fairy tales were so dark? Stories like this were not originally written for children. They were part of an adult storytelling tradition filled with warnings, moral lessons, and reflections of the harsh realities of life. Over time, many of these tales were rewritten and softened. The darker elements were removed, the endings became happier, and the stories slowly transformed into the fairy tales we recognize today. Today, Sleeping Beauty is remembered as a romantic story about a princess awakened by true love. But hidden beneath the version we know lies an older story, one shaped by darker ideas about fate, power, and justice. A reminder that the fairy tales we grew up with often began as something very different, because the story may be familiar, but the truth behind it rarely is. Until next time, another page waits in the dark origins of fairy tales. While the story of Sleeping Beauty tells of a princess trapped in enchanted sleep, the folklore collected by the Brothers Grimm contains other strange tales of people imprisoned by magic. One of these lesser-known stories is called The Glass Coffin. In this tale, a young tailor wanders deep into the mountains searching for work. While traveling through the forest, he meets a mysterious deer who leads him to a hidden castle carved into the side of a mountain. Inside the castle, the tailor discovers something extraordinary. A beautiful young woman, lying perfectly still inside a coffin made entirely of glass. She is alive, but trapped by a powerful enchantment. The castle itself is under the control of a wicked magician who has imprisoned the young woman and transformed her brother into the very deer that led the tailor there. Hidden within the castle is a small wooden box containing a crystal key. When the tailor opens it, the enchantment begins to break. The glass coffin shatters, the young woman awakens, and the spell over the castle collapses. Her brother is restored to human form, and the wicked magician's power is finally destroyed. In gratitude for his courage, the tailor marries the young woman he helped free. Stories like the glass coffin remind us that long before the tale of Sleeping Beauty became famous, many fairy tales told of people caught between life and sleep, imprisoned by magic, and waiting for someone brave enough to break the spell. Thank you for listening. If you're interested in the dark origins of fairy tales, why not subscribe? It's free, I promise. Turn on notifications and never miss another chapter. Leave a comment. Is there a fairy tale you'd like to know the dark origin? Let us know, and don't forget to give the video a thumbs up. It really helps us out. We hope you've enjoyed this dark origins of fairy tales. Return next week for a new episode. Snow White, the Queen's Cruel Punishment.